the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries, a podcast about imaginary things in books, film, television, comics, and more. In this episode, we discussed A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. We recorded this some time ago, and due to ongoing conflicts and concerns over our audio quality, we hesitated to upload it because it does sound just awful. However, we had a lot of fun recording this episode and we didn't want the audio to go to waste. So if you are interested in A Wrinkle in Time and three nerds talking about it at length, please continue on and listen to the rest of this episode. If you're looking for other sci-fi and fantasy musings in our podcast, go ahead and skip forward to the much superior audio of episode 4, in which Tony and I discuss Luna New Moon by Ian MacDonald. Meanwhile, stick around as Tony, I, and Alyssa discuss A Wrinkle in Time. I should have said me, shouldn't I, instead of I? Never mind. Carry on. A Wrinkle in Time. So we're talking about Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. And I would just like to begin as a librarian with the comment that it's really hard to catalog this book because it spans the boundary between junior fiction and young adult fiction. And we have more reasons for cataloging an item as YA than just age level. You know, content, themes, that sort of thing plays into why we catalog things the way we do. So that can often be the deciding factor depending on which library you're at. So in our library, I believe this book is actually cataloged in junior fiction, right next to like Harry Potter and the Rick Riordan books. So I find it really interesting how people respond to reading junior fiction when they're adults. I just find it really fascinating because we're revisiting a very specific reading level in addition to revisiting things that are rife with deep emotions, especially if you read them as a child. You know, it comes with baggage, and I find that interesting. So Alyssa, I know that you have baggage with this book, and you have thoughts in terms of how it maybe doesn't measure up the way that you thought it was going to on a reread. So do you want to just kind of start us off with your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to explain a little bit. Well, first of all, I have read this book before. I might have been in my young teen years a long time ago, and I remembered nothing. So rereading this now is like rereading it for the first time. Only now I'm a full adult, so I have had a lot more experiences. I've read a lot more literature. I've come to understand my world in vastly different ways than when I was younger. And I'm bringing, I wouldn't necessarily call it baggage, but I am bringing all that I am now into this story. And honestly, I did not really enjoy this book. And I would separate that it doesn't necessarily mean I didn't like it. Like, I can talk about positive things in the book, things that maybe the book did well, some significance that this book has had for others, but it did not grab me now as an adult. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because it was YA, because I've loved other young adult fiction, but I think that regardless of what other thoughts like get shared throughout this cast and everything, that I did have into it. I honestly did not really like the children. and they just didn't come across. I don't know. I have a small tolerance for arrogance, and very arrogant. I didn't like that he was constantly the gifted one and somehow the special one. He's 5 years old. I don't know where. I can understand that, but I didn't. It felt way over the top here, expectedly so, and I kept kind of waiting for what his importance was. I think maybe importance of the characters are, even though they each have something unique, maybe it's putting it in a larger context that I struggle with, of what's the overall theme. In some ways it's friendship, in some ways it's finding your worth. I don't know. So I don't know, maybe somebody else can throw something in to help give this direction, but I just...
Well, we're all adults here rereading it, I believe.
Yeah.
My connection to it was different as a child as compared to your connection to it as a child. So I necessarily bring along with a reread all of the feelings I had about it as a child, which puts me in a different place. I read it multiple times when I was young and very angry, and I have never empathized or sympathized with Charles Wallace. He has always pissed me off. I just must say that. I think Charles Wallace must exist to piss us off because he does such a good job. He's a little arrogant fart who always knows way more than he lets on, and he restricts what information he's willing to tell the others, even though he knows it, and it could potentially alter how they approach the situation, which in my mind is the least good thing to do in a crisis situation, is not communicate. That's my personal opinion, but I think L'Engle was deliberate in making him less of the character that you're supposed to empathize with than Meg. And I personally, I split as a child my empathy between Meg and Calvin, and that takes me to my favorite moment in the book, which I will unveil in a minute. But Meg is so angry, and I got that on a deep spiritual level as a kid. I was a kid raised in a conservative Christian home. I wasn't allowed to be angry. I wasn't allowed to be exceptional in the areas, the very limited areas that I was actually exceptional. I wasn't allowed to be. I was supposed to just go with the flow. I was supposed to be seen, not heard. I actually heard that line multiple times come from both my parents. So to have a character like Meg, who is approved within the Christian literary canon, and we can talk about that later, but Wrinkle in Time is considered a safe book for Christians, and yet Meg here is so angry and so herself, fiercely herself, that I just really loved her. And Calvin, he was looking for that second home, that home away from home. And that was my college experience. So when I reread it for the first time in college, I was like, I'm Calvin. So as a kid, I was Meg. As a high school, college kid, I was Calvin. And then now I don't know what I am. But that's why I approach it differently, because I had this connection to Meg and Calvin that you didn't as a kid. I don't know, maybe you were less angry, but...
no, I definitely had angry sides, but I think that maybe I wasn't reading them then.
No, I needed the permission to be angry, so I connected with her in a different way than someone who didn't need permission to be angry. Tony, what was your first encounter with this book? Was it when you were little as well?
So, I believe I read A Wrinkle in Time for the first time when I was somewhere between the ages of 8 and 12, maybe. I know that's a pretty large range. I cannot remember. I do remember I was reading it at a time I was picking up a lot of other books that, if they weren't thematically similar, then they were similar in ways that have stuck with me. I can't remember what a lot of them were, but I always sort of associate A Wrinkle in Time with Harriet the Spy, which on the surface sort of looked like as different as you could possibly get, and still be in the same medium. But I think that the reason why I associate them with each other is not only temporally, like when I came to them, but they're from a similar time. I think A Wrinkle in Time was published in 1962, Harriet's Spy was published in 1964, and even for me, reading books when I was, mid-late 90s, and coming to these, it just, both of them, Meg in A Wrinkle in Time and Harriet the Spy, like Kendra said, seem so unabashedly themselves and like they had faults. And in A Wrinkle in Time, Meg's faults are, what ends up working for them in their first encounter with it and how they get away, really. And in Harriet the Spy, Harriet is a very flawed character who does a lot of growing, but also does a lot of shouting and a lot of things that probably, were I looking back on Harriet the Spy in my life story, I'd be like, oh, shit, I did that. But, sort of like unapologetically themselves, even though Harriet the Spy is very much based in the real world and A Wrinkle in Time is like crazy all over the universe, but, these characters who are angry and emotional, and I don't mean that and I guess the way that I mean that is I'm pretty sure I came to this when I was more or less like Kendra. I was in Catholic school, I think, and it was not exactly a repressive environment, but as non-repressive of an environment as you can get and still be in Catholic school. So it was still definitely, like, I could read whatever I wanted. I picked up Animorphs back then, so it's not, like I was really looking for characters like these. But I appreciated Meg, and I compared her to Harriet, and I remember these two books as a pair of books for that reason. Just that these characters kind of offered permission that I wasn't getting from other places to experience things and react to them in a way that wasn't supposed to be so very cultivated. That's not the word I'm looking for. So very curated. Because Meg's faults are what saved the day, and Harriet has to, make sense of the big mess that her life becomes. And I appreciated that. It was really good to read through those things.
Well, and I was thinking, as you were talking about Harriet the Spy, this book came into my life around the same time as a bunch of other books featuring really strong children characters or colorful children characters. And one of the books that came into my life roughly at the same time was Ender's Game. And Ender, I find an interesting contrast to Charles Wallace, because both are child geniuses, but for some reason we connect differently with Ender than we do with Charles Wallace. And Ender's not necessarily gifted with ESP, as it seems like Charles Wallace is, but he's a brilliant child. He's a strategist. He's brilliant in his own way, and yet you can connect with him. I don't know whether it's because he's the primary character and Charles Wallace isn't, but there are other books in the Wrinkle in Time quartet in which Charles Wallace plays a larger role, and also in which Sandy and Dennis have larger roles. I think that's a Swiftly Tilting Planet, where they get to hang out with the Nephilim and all those wonderful folks. Alyssa, when did you read Ender's Game for the first time?
Was it college, perhaps? It might have been, I got to it in high school when the movie came out. But I don't remember how close to the movie, because I actually read the first two. I read Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead. Mm-hmm. I like Ender's Game. I thought the world was pretty cool though too, but that's like sci-fi. This is more science fantasy. So the science fiction, I think, draws me a little better, and I think maybe that's part of why I had trouble with getting. It's not that the story was bad; it's just I couldn't get sucked in.
Uh-huh.
because I couldn't, where I am now, I don't identify strongly with any of the characters. Maybe it's just my mood this week, hard to say. But I think I have a little bit trouble getting drawn into strictly fantasy, even though I like it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had another thought just a moment ago. I think maybe I had trouble taking feeling like there was any real danger. Right? Like in Ender's Game, there does feel like there's serious danger. There's a goal that you're working towards. And I realize the goal in A Wrinkle is to save their father, but he never felt in danger to me. Like, I know he's just being held captive somewhere. There's no, like, hints that he's being tortured. And I realize that makes it go in, like, dark places for a kid book. But it just didn't really feel like there was any danger. Meg's just really, really intense on getting to their dad. Calvin's kind of like, hey, what up? And Charles is like, y'all are dumb, and I'm gonna talk over you all and tell you guys what to do. And I thought he's bossy, so he bothered me, which is fine. I'm sure he's supposed to. I have a lot of tolerance for arrogance. But Meg I can understand her being unhappy, because some of the things that she's unhappy about, I probably do identify with. But I couldn't be drawn into her plight for some reason.
I wonder how much of that Well, I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that the villain in A Wrinkle in Time is so clearly pandering to Cold War era fears. I think we are in a different place socially and culturally right now. We're in a different historical moment where fear of being ramrodded into uniformity and conformity, we're not as afraid of those things anymore. In fact, there's almost a push, at least if you're a Democrat, to work together to overcome social evils. Not necessarily a push towards conformity, but a push towards togetherness. So, okay. Tony, you have a thought.
Yeah, I do. I might start putting up my hand just because I know the audio sort of drops out when we talk over each other. But there's a bit that apparently, I'm not sure who cut it, whether it was the publisher or Madeleine L'Engle herself or who along the way, but apparently in the I don't want to say downtime, but downtime between when they face it on Camazotz for the first time and leave Charles Wallace there, and then when Meg goes back to Camazotz, there was a conversation between Meg Calvin and Mr. Murray where they talk about security and how democracy can go bad. And it's interesting because, I think this book certainly when I was a kid, a lot of things went way over my head in this book. And like coming back to it as an adult, I'm like, these are some pretty advanced concepts. And I think you're right that it's like really important to keep in mind that it was during the Cold War and it was socially and culturally a very different time. But this one bit that was cut out that talked about stuff. Let me just read it to you guys. I pulled it up specifically for this. So Meg says, but I still don't see why security isn't a good thing. Why bother? I've come to the conclusion, Mr. Murray said slowly, that it's the greatest evil there is. Suppose your great-great-grandmother and all those like her had worried about security. They'd never have gone across the land in flimsy-covered wagons. Our country has been greatest when it has been most insecure. This sick longing for security is a dangerous thing, Meg, as insidious as the strontium-90 for our nuclear explosions. You can't feel it or touch it, so it's there. So is the panicky searching for conformity for security. Which I think is really an interesting way to look at it, because I would say there are bits just in that quote that I really agree with and I think are super timely, and also very, very smart. And again, I think, that was part of that time, and yet there are parts that are definitely part of our time as well. And that in this book, Madeleine L'Engle is sort of, putting out there this sort of conformity as frightening. And this is Kamazox is a planet on which the dark thing has taken over, and that results in this kind of loss of rugged American individualism. It's also sort of, very much a 2016 thing by saying we also cannot rely on security. And I feel like I have potentially a point here. And we'll maybe go back to our post-9/11 Star Trek conversation. But I'm gonna leave it there. I just wanted to throw out that quote too. Yes.
Well, I connect with a lot of what you're saying about that passage, but I have to admit I'm really glad she cut out, or the editor cut out, or the publisher cut out any reference to manifest destiny, which we know now is such a problematic vision of America. Like, we're at our best when pioneers are crossing the country in covered wagons. Really? Like, we want to go back to that time and talk about, mass genocide of Native peoples in the blithe same sentence as these dysentery-ridden peoples who felt compelled to leave their homes because their homes were poverty-ridden or for whatever reason. I mean, the pioneers didn't move west just for the joy of moving west. They moved west because they were compelled to, for one reason or another. So I think it's really problematic to talk about manifest destiny today in such broadly approving terms. But the conversation about security, I mean, we've come full circle to thinking about security as one of our primary national interests, right? Like, I was driving home today from work, and the NPR segment on air was about the NSA getting hacked, and it was talking about how safe are we if the best hackers in the world are getting hacked, and I was like, So security is at the forefront of the American imagination and thought process right now. But I think the science fiction and the science fantasy coming out of that looks very different. And I just finished Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation last night, and I mean there are conversations there about what does security actually look like. Is it knowing the truth, or is it believing what you think you know, or is it some other tenuous thing? So that's fascinating. What edition of the books do you guys actually have?
Oh, Lord. I have a book that says the reading level is grade 5.8. I'm not sure exactly what grade that would be. Like,
no, that's grade
March
5,
is the fifth grade?
There are like benchmarks you reach within each grade level in reading now. It's very complex. People keep coming into the library asking for like grade point 4.3 or grade 7.9 or whatever. I don't honestly know the grade point system because I don't personally care, but it is in a library's best interest to know that system is out there and to either embrace it and put together materials promoting books along those lines, or to be able to voice as a staff, no, we reject this ridiculous reading grading system, so you won't find our books organized according to those levels. So in a lot of elementary school libraries, Tony, you go in and you actually find the books arranged according to grade point levels and the benchmarks they have to reach within each grade. So it's weird.
Yeah. In any event, mine is from, or was republished in March 1976. It's a little trade paperback from Dell. It looks like the imprint is something Laurel Leaf. I don't know what that is, but
interesting.
Yep.
How about you, Alyssa?
Mine's the 54th printing in 1994.
Okay. So mine is the most recent printing, and it's actually, the reason why I bring this up is because I think this introduction to my specific edition was, this was the first edition with which this particular introduction was provided. And it's written by Anna Quindlen, who is a famous author in her own right these days. I think she's a Pulitzer Prize winner and author of books like Miller's Valley, Still Life with Breadcrumbs might be one of her more famous ones. So she has a lot of books out there, but she wrote an introduction, and I love her first paragraph. Is it okay if I just read it?
Go for it.
Yeah.
the most memorable books from our childhoods are those that make us feel less alone, convince us that our own foibles and quirks are both as individual as a fingerprint and as universal as an open hand. That's why I still have the copy of A Wrinkle in Time that was given to me when I was 12 years old. It long ago lost its dust jacket, the fabric binding is loose and water-stained, and the soft and loopy signature on its inside cover bears little resemblance to the way I sign my name today. The girl who first owned it has grown up and changed, but the book she loved, though battered, is still magical. And I think that that paragraph of this introduction kind of sums up what makes or breaks reading a novel like A Wrinkle in Time for people. Because for me, this book is memorable because I have this connection to it that's very, very nostalgic, that goes way back to this other person that I used to be. Whereas Alyssa came at it from a different perspective, and she did not necessarily have this younger Alyssa back in her mental vault that needed this book the way that, I did. So I think that there's something to the nostalgia factor about this book, the reason why it's still around, the reason why people still read it, even though clearly it has its flaws as a work of like modern science fantasy. Like it wouldn't fly today. And it almost didn't fly back in the day, right? Like she struggled to find a publisher for it. So I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there as you don't need to feel bad if you didn't connect with this, in part because books like this, as Anna Quindlen makes clear, are deeply, how we receive them is deeply tied to nostalgia, which I kind of despise sometimes. So I don't know how you guys feel about nostalgia loves, but like, Alyssa, you've been watching Stranger Things, right?
Yes.
And Stranger Things is series that is like entirely nostalgia, right?
Yeah, it's pretty, I didn't grow up with Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, I've only played an RPG once. But it takes place in the 80s, and it has so many elements that even though I was a wee infant in the late 80s, even I can still feel sort of this nostalgia for that childhood, sort of that innocence, but yet that also, that sort of longing for adulthood and that desire to do and to be, and they take charge of what they have control over and ignore the adults because the adults are a little bit behind, and kids know things that are important and they act on that. Mm-hmm. And they take responsibility, and their friendships feel I would say kind of adult-like, but I think the word maybe is more mature, because it's less of age being the problem and just like a depth. And I think that that's something that perhaps lacks in A Wrinkle in Time, where in Stranger Than Fiction, if you buy that camaraderie.
You're talking about Stranger Things,
they work
right?
together. Yeah, did I say Stranger? What did I say?
You said Stranger Than Fiction, which is also an excellent nostalgia movie.
Yeah, it's one of those I've been saying weird words. So, yes, I meant Stranger Things. Mm-hmm. I'll try not to do that again. I meant in Stranger Things.
Go for it.
Yeah, in Stranger Things, they fight, and they kind of figure it out on their own. And I didn't feel like in A Wrinkle in Time the kids were really unified in any way. Well, doing their own thing, they just happened to be together. I mean, their family, or it was a happenstance encounter when they go back to the haunted house and meet Calvin. And then it seemed like Calvin was just a tag-along, and he didn't, because of his own struggles with feeling like he doesn't fit in, he doesn't quite get enveloped by the familial friendship and relationship that Charles and Meg already have. And then he doesn't get too many lines. And so then when they say things like, "you're important," I'm kind of wondering why. What action do you have in this story? And that was kind of true for all of the characters. And that importance gets shown more clearly to me towards the end, where I feel like the action picks up a little bit. There is the aspect of danger that I think was not hit upon as much in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Partially because for the first half of the book, we don't really know where the father is. We don't really know what he's encountering, and so we can't, I personally at least, could not feel any fear for what may or may not be happening to him. And I think that fear of the unknown is valid, but they hadn't painted just enough of a picture of that unknown for me to imagine some sort of danger. And I think that to tie that back briefly with the security comments is that in some ways, like with the Cold War, that's not current anymore, and we moved beyond that. So some of those fears may not exist. But that fear of not necessarily, we do still have fear of terrorism and physical danger, but I think that there's also elements both in this book that can translate and maybe transcend to any time period. Is just that fear of being controlled mm-hmm. and not being yourself. Well, we also want security and protection and unity, and I would argue that there's some security in lose yourself and relinquish the freedom of choice because of, and the book even states, some of the burdens that come with that. And I don't know, I think I would identify more with the fear of losing individuality, right? Like, who am I now? Mm-hmm. Physical security. What would you like to say, Ken?
Just that you made a really interesting connection there, and I want to pick up on it. However, before I do that, I want to say that passage that I read, the cut passage, I think that you're absolutely right, Kendra, in that it is much better to have left out the manifest destiny part. And it's actually interesting to me that passage is apparently being put back into a new version of the book that is coming out or did come out last year or something like that. One of those definitive author's editions or something like that. So I think it's interesting that not the other way around. There was something that, was unproblematic about including Manifest Destiny in the 60s, and now there's an edition that removes it, but instead it's the opposite. Anyway, that's not directly what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is that idea, again, thinking about Star Trek and our last podcast when I talked about how one of the things that I really liked about Star Trek Beyond is that it gets back to one of the core foundational Star Trek truths, which is that strength comes from unity. And it's interesting because in A Wrinkle in Time, sameness and conformity are, put out there sort of like, I don't want to say the ultimate evil, but the ultimate evil. Also, I'm thinking if there's a drinking game around our podcast, every time I say, I don't want to say blank, but I'm going to say blank, should be a drinking time. So, you should just drink twice.
I don't have water.
What's important, and what I want to say, there's a great bit that Meg says in their first encounter with it, and I totally bookmarked it. But, okay, so Meg says, Meg's trying to recite the Declaration of Independence, and then Charles Wallace, as possessed by it, says, but that's exactly what we have on Camazotz, complete equality, everybody exactly alike. And then Meg yells back, no, like and equal are not the same thing at all. And I think that's something interesting and something that is worth teasing apart because in the same way that Meg says like and wow, I just forgot the word. Like and equal are not the same thing. The way that Star Trek sort of portrays this willful, thoughtful, intentional strength from unity is really, really different than the way that A Wrinkle in Time is portraying this thoughtless, evil conformity, this conformity as manifestation of great evil. And I guess I want to throw that out there because thinking about Star Trek, thinking about A Wrinkle in Time, both of which are things that got their start in the 60s and yet are being updated. We have, the reboot movies, the new Star Trek series. We have the new film coming out, I think, in the next year or two, film adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time. So, thinking about these ideas and putting them in the future, how do you sort of take apart what's good about strength from unity without talking about weakness from conformity in a complicated way. And I think that A Wrinkle in Time is a good way to do that, or it does a good job of doing that, even though it's not primary, in a way that's packaged well for, us as young people, when we were young people, and hopefully young people today. But it's worth, sort of thinking about that and the repercussions that it could have. And that may also give us a good segue into talking about the movie and how in the hell that adaptation is going to work in 2016 or 2017 or 2018 or whatever it is.
Well, I think to kind of take a bunny trail off of your thought, the film adaptation is a little bit further out than you expect. They just recruited their first actor, and it's Oprah Winfrey. So that's the banner actor around which the other actors will probably congregate. So she's the name that draws in the minor names, right? But it is being directed by, I think, Ava DuVernay. And she has a couple films like Selma, I believe, under her belt that offer some potential for this commentary about greater societal questions of security, of conformity, of danger, what's really dangerous out there. I think that the framework she gave in Selma could provide some interesting avenues into that. I mean, she's clearly interested in civil rights and in these questions. So you never know. It could be really fantastic. Or it could be a complete bomb. But we're kind of used to that with A Wrinkle in Time, given the 2003 miniseries adaptation, which was absolute trash, but also kind of irresistible trash if you're a nostalgia fan. So I don't know. I did not despise it entirely. I despised it almost entirely. But at the same time, I was like, oh, here's angry little Meg, and I get to see her again. Yes. Go, Tony.
The other thing I want to say about that, because I agree with you 100% about Ava DuVernay as an excellent choice, and someone to really give this movie adaptation the gravity I think it's going to need. I looked at the writer, Jennifer Lee, who has written Wreck-It Ralph, and was behind the story for Zootopia. And I saw both of those, and I thought that they were really thoughtful, complex ways to approach. I mean, I think that the scripts themselves were thoughtful and complex, and so I think that combination of director and writer is tentatively a really, really good sign for this adaptation. And I'm cautiously very optimistic, or very cautiously optimistic, or very cautiously very optimistic.
And Alyssa, here's a little nugget of wisdom I just looked up on Google. She was also involved in I, Robot, which I know was a film that you enjoyed a great deal. So, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that this could turn out well, or a complete trash fire, or?
I think that I personally will be, I'm eager then to see what the opening box office reviews are. Well, I hesitate now sometimes to see movies opening weekend. They're about, or I'm kind of one of those, I'll save $10 in a Redbox and it for $1 6 months from now. But I wonder, I feel like this might be a little bit of a segue into, there are obvious Christian and religious themes in this book, which are, in fact, are overtly stated, and I'm kind of curious about how that's going to translate in this future film. I realize we have in the past decade done a couple of Narnia films, and so Christian films aren't out of the realm of possibility, but this one is not necessarily as heavy-handed. Well, maybe Narnia is not heavy-handed.
I think it's pretty heavy-handed. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of that... For me, it's kind of that combination between it can stand alone as pure fantasy, but there's the obvious allegory to, like, the crucifixion and all of that jazz, and I think that everybody gets that. Whereas, in fact, while I was reading, and I realized, you start realizing that the three, I'll just call it, the three Mrs. W's, I might call them the witches for short, because they kind of...
They're witchy.
Aspect to them. Yeah, they're witchy. And you even have Mrs. Witch. I like that aspect. They're angels. And as I figured that out, then I kept expecting, and I think it was having had experience with and enjoying more some of the Narnia tales, that I kept expecting then, okay, we have angels, then other characters are going to represent specific biblical characters. Like Avalon is obviously Jesus, so I was like, okay, so who's going to be like a Jesus character or a God character? And then I was like, silly. I had the thought, and then I realized I dismissed it. But I was like, maybe even the witches symbolize the Trinity in some way. And then I was like, oh wait, no, you're not supposed to bow to them. So like, they're obviously angels. They're not elevated to it. I kept waiting for... You go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that this book is a very, very interesting book in its connection to, like, Christian culture. Because on the one hand, yes, there's clear... Like, there are actual excerpts of the scripture in this book, which doesn't ever really happen in Narnia. So in that sense, it's way more upfront about its faith leanings. But on the other hand, the Mrs. W's make some really problematic statements if we're taking it as face value Christian allegory. Like, they say some things which broaden it out to almost a universalism that Christianity traditionally, especially evangelical Christianity, has resisted. And I think Narnia, there are moments where we are told, I think it's especially in The Magician's Nephew and The Last Battle, that this is the same world as yours. Aslan is just Jesus in a different form, but we don't have that direct statement by the magical or fantastical figures that we are these other characters. And actually in A Swiftly Tilting Planet, you have the Nephilim, which are fallen angels, right? Like, you have them show up as major characters. So they're very clearly saying, hey, we are these biblical figures. But the Mrs. W's don't do that. They don't say we are this or that in relation to faith. So I think that they're a little bit more problematic, and they say some things that would be considered problematic if it was coming from a pastor lectern in a church. So yeah, okay, Tony.
It's interesting because, like, I think of, Christian fantasy for young readers, immediately Narnia, especially, and, Narnia is so, sort of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has become for me, and I think a lot of people, like, what they go to. When you say Narnia and you describe it, it's the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that's, I think I read all the books once upon a time, but, the first three especially, including Prince Caspian and Voyage of the Dawn Treader, were really the ones that I thought of as core to that. And I know that some folks who like all 7 books from the Narnia series, or who know them well, say that there are some deeply problematic things later in the series, and it gets more ham-fisted. And, like, the first one, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is kind of like a pleasant allegorical romp, which, maybe you have that, maybe you don't. I think in some ways Narnia was a lot easier to translate to film, because on its surface you can also just have, it's a big budget Hollywood fantasy with like some kids who get stuck in the middle of, you know, talking animals versus like my brain is not working today. Mythological, not figures, but like witches and demons and bad things versus good talking animals, and it's very easy to adapt. When I think of A Wrinkle in Time, I actually connect it more with His Dark Materials. Even though I don't think of His Dark Materials as for young readers, you know, it also has a young woman protagonist who goes through, and not necessarily a similar emotional journey to Meg, but Lyra, especially in The Golden Compass, you know, it hits a lot of the same notes, I think. Especially in that both those books, and I'm thinking here specifically of, I shouldn't say those books, let's say A Wrinkle in Time, the books that follow, but specifically A Wrinkle in Time, and His Dark Materials, those three books, do a lot with Christianity specifically, which is sort of unexpected. And I don't want to put them at all on a level field because in His Dark Materials, they kill God. I'm just sorry, I should have said spoiler alert, but that series has been out for 15 years, so deal with it. But in A Wrinkle, it's interesting because one of the reasons I think of this as a science fantasy is I know that Madeleine L'Engle is really interested, or was really interested in, cutting edge science. And I forget which one of the sequels it is, but they actually go and talk with Charles Wallace's mitochondria or something, or go inside the mitochondria, something like that.
That's a good one.
But we get one direct suggestion that the Mrs. W's are angels, and yet they refer to themselves as stars. Mrs. Whatsit is over 2 billion years old, and she's the youngest of them. And many times, many more times than they say they're angels, they don't actually ever say that. Calvin says that once. They say they're stars, which I think is a really interesting and open-ended way to do it, because obviously, and reading back through it, I actually picked up on very, very little of the Christian background in this book when I was a kid. It's more overt now. I picked up more of it on this reread, but I don't think it was ever as overt or as heavy-handed as in Narnia, even though Narnia is never quotes from the Bible, only does allegorical stuff. But by sort of implicating Jesus as one of the people who fights the dark, that's sort of pushing it in that way. And by having the Mrs. W's, especially Mrs. Who, quote from the Bible a couple of times, it does that. But also, the Buddha fought the darkness. Gandhi fought the darkness.
Yeah.
We get those direct checks as well. And I think I think that you're right in that, it's a sort of universalist Christian approach to it. And I would not expect anything different from a writer like Madeleine L'Engle, who is very much, in the world, very deeply interested in science at the same time. And this is sort of like one of those books that, reading all the stories about how difficult it was to get published, I can almost sort of understand it 50 years later, because it's still sort of, even though it's become part of the canon and has won the Newbery, and, has been lauded in many different ways, I don't think you can take A Wrinkle in Time and sort of sketch out the things that followed as far as these are directly related, or it clearly has, there are books that come after that you can trace back to Wrinkle in Time thematically, or in terms of similar characters, or in terms of similar plot elements, or the way that they handle science and faith, or whatever it happens to be. I think A Wrinkle in Time and books that followed are kind of pretty singular, and that's interesting that they've stood for so long.
They're such weird books. I mean, there are diagrams in one chapter. There are quotes from Euripides and Shakespeare's The Tempest and all of these other authors. Like Mrs. Who uses other people's words as her own, right? That becomes a plot element. She finds it easier to adopt the language of others than to come up with her own words, as Mrs. Whatsit explains. Yeah, now I don't know. It's such a weird book that could this book be published today through the traditional publishing platform? I don't know if it could, because the traditional publishing platform, in response to self-publishing really lifting up the niche genres, traditional publishing has almost gone the opposite direction and said, well, you guys are doing a great job bringing out these really weird books. We're going to focus on selling the books that we know are going to sell lots of copies. And I don't know that a publisher looking at a manuscript of a book like A Wrinkle in Time today would look at it as a big seller. I think they would look at it as, well, you might reach some people, but it's a bit too weird, you know?
Is I like your word universalist, Tony, because there's even a spot, one thing that did jump out at me immediately was when they meet Aunt Beef, and they're trying to decide what to call them and how to reference these creatures, and they come up, the name for their planet is Ischel, which immediately jumped out at me. I paused, I put it down, and I did like just a very brief research, because that word stood out to me as possibly being Mayan, Incan, or Aztec. And I looked it up, and Ischel is actually the name of the Mayan jaguar goddess of midwifery and childbirth. And just the very next page, there was some sort of childbirth and midwifery imagery that stood out to me more because of that use of that word. And I'm not going to put any huge significance into that because I don't really have anything else past. I mean, I can read you some of the imagery if you want, but it stood out to me as strange, especially as I'm kind of realizing there's this Christian sort of theological aspect to it. But as you point out, and when I look at it as a whole, I'm kind of questioning how much Christian theology is there besides some Bible quotes, and what kind of theology is being presented. It's very clear in Narnia, which never directly quotes the Bible, but because of the way that it phrases things and talks about the world and how we interact with it, it is very clearly drawing on Christian theology. Whereas this book, it even involves hard science, which is wonderful, but in the past, science and Christianity have not always gotten along, and yet she even lauds mathematicians as having fought that light, or fought the darkness for the light. And so, I don't know, that was just kind of some of the thoughts that were going through my mind in the past few minutes.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to continue in that line of thinking to the people and the works of literature that the children are encouraged to remember at times of crisis to bolster their sort of affinity to truth and free thinking. So I believe Meg starts thinking about the mathematicians, and that might be where you were thinking too, where she's facing it and she's trying to protect her mind against the influence of it. And so she starts, she quotes the Declaration of Independence. She thinks of these mathematicians that were important in all of these wonderful things. So I think that there's a lot about this book that the more you think about it, the more you find a real problematic fit with traditional conservative evangelical thinking, which I think might have been subtly one of the things that I loved so much about it as a kid, coming from a conservative background where freedom of thought was not necessarily encouraged. So, Tony, I know you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and go out there and say I don't think this book would be published today. I think that it was anticipating, well, it was reflecting the time for sure. I think you, way back when, were absolutely on target when you said it was, part of the Cold War era. And that's definitely a part of it. But I think it was anticipating a future that sort of didn't happen, where we would have ease of access with complicated protagonists like Meg, and where things like mixing the hard science that's in A Wrinkle in Time and, not even theology necessarily, but like philosophy even, in making a children's book that still, sort of has those, I don't want to say timeless, but those big themes like good versus evil, which for God's sake you can see in like so many, not only books for young readers, but books and media of all sorts for all ages. And it definitely hits those notes, but I think that this would be a really hard sell. Which brings me back to thinking about the film adaptation, and thinking about it as, like, maybe a cousin to The Golden Compass, which had its...
Are you thinking of the
we
film
can go into that
adaptation?
a different time, but that movie was essentially a travesty, because they took the teeth out of it. And I think what works so well for A Wrinkle in Time is that it's so weird, is that it's so contrary. This book is in many ways a portrait of Meg, who is a contrary character, and the book itself, I think, is contrary. And so how do you capture that? And how do you not only capture it, but embrace it? And I do think that the folks who are involved with the production of the movie are very, very well placed to do that and have, the resumes to back up that they can do that. But, say they make just a standout adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time that, is not obviously word for word, page for page, translation of the book, because that's not what we want. We don't want the book on screen. We want a movie that hits a lot of the same points. But, if we do hit those same emotional and thematic points that the book does, and, we get a weird movie that appeals to young people like we were, who were searching for something that, was a little bit, I don't want to say, God, I keep saying this, I don't want to say, not necessarily like the special snowflake syndrome, but like, the folks who weren't necessarily comfortable with expressing emotions or expressing their anger or being intelligent or whatever, that may have been, is that a thing that the movie is going to do? I hope so. Is that a thing that the book did? Most definitely. Is that a thing that publishers would be looking for if this book was on the market today? I don't know, and I really don't think that this book would be a success. I don't even know if it would get picked up by a publishing house or by an agent.
I was just gonna add. I think this book is subversive in really interesting ways. I'm getting major feedback on my end, by the way. I don't know if you guys are.
Me too.
I think it's really interesting how... Whoa, lots of feedback. Super loud feedback. Like it's actually repeating what I'm saying. I
was getting that earlier.
Stop. Is it going to say it? It's still going. Stop. Darn it! Someone else talk for a couple minutes and then come back.
This is going to be a very entertaining moment or a cut.
It's a cut.
Well, okay, so. It was funny because for me, I was literally just hearing my words back. For you, there's this slight echo kind of aspect to it, and I'm like, you sound like this is Witch who talk like that, and it's very drawn out, and I was like, it feels real!
Maybe I'm okay now.
Not gonna lie.
I'm okay now. I'm gonna talk.
Yeah,
okay.
You sound good now.
So I find it really interesting. This is a really subversive novel, and it shows up in other texts in very interesting ways. I think my favorite example is actually the television series Lost, in which this book repeatedly shows up, and it's a book that Sawyer, if you remember, the Sawyer character is reading multiple times throughout the Lost series. So if you want to talk about books showing up in other texts and that providing sort of Easter egg important information, yes, Tony.
I just remembered that one of the reasons why I did want to talk about this as well is that in Chelsea Clinton's speech at the DNC, she actually referenced A Wrinkle in Time along with a couple of other books, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I thought it was a really interesting choice to sort of, bring that in specifically because it's not, you could swap out and say, I don't know, I liked book X or book Y or book Z, my Good Night Moon, for God's sake, my my mother read this to me when I was growing up, that A Wrinkle in Time is such a subversive book and such a specific book that it's an interesting thing to get name checked during that speech, because I think that you're going to have, for a lot of young people, from us to Anna Quindlen to Chelsea Clinton, these connections that aren't necessarily so easily taken away by anything else. And I guess what I mean by that is when Chelsea Clinton says A Wrinkle in Time, it isn't just stand-in for my mother read to me, my father read to me, my parents read to me, we read this book together, or whatever. It's a very specific set of memories using a very specific book. And I found that striking, that was the choice. So anyway, that was just an aside. In the news, Chelsea Clinton, Wrinkle in Time.
I had forgotten that was a book referenced. I want this feedback to stop.